Hello and welcome to this week's case, which is the case of Hilda Marchbank and Susan May. Now you'll see from the thumbnail that this is solved with a question mark, because even though in the eyes of the law it is technically solved, as far as the legal system is concerned, the right person has been convicted, there's a huge amount of doubt about that. And I'll go further into this, and at the end of this you may want to make your own mind up, or you might want to do some more research, up to you. This was originally going to be the video that I make my comeback on this channel on. This was the one that I really wanted to do even before I started the channel. I thought I have to do this case, and I actually had filmed this case some weeks back, but when I watched it back and I was editing, there were a couple of bits that I missed out, which I really regretted doing. I didn't want to film it again, and it was just like, it was not right. The setting wasn't right. So as you can see, I've got a whole new setting. I've got a corner of the room to myself, and I've put a few decorations up, and it's basically just to make it more, less boring, because you guys have been staring at the wardrobe and my chest of drawers for a long time. So this is going to be a bit different. I've got a proper setup now, and I'm hoping to make the cases a lot more interesting. And this case in particular is one that I feel very strongly about, because it involves a potential miscarriage of justice. It's one that really touched me, and I would encourage you to even do your own research while you're watching this or afterwards or whichever. As with all of my videos, I welcome corrections should they be needed. I'm happy to cite them in the description or in a comment if I'm wrong at any point or any new information comes to light. But I really do hope you enjoy watching this and it piques your interest. Hilda Marchbank was an 89-year-old woman who lived in Royton, Greater Manchester, and she lived very near a nice leafy rural park in a nice sort of suburban area of Royton. Hilda Marchbank had been married and widowed, but had never actually had any children of her own. She had a sister whose name I couldn't find, unfortunately, and she was very close to her sister's side of the family. Her sister had two daughters, Susan and Anne. Both girls saw their aunt and their mother almost every day. They were extremely close as a unit. They did almost everything together. Susan described her aunt as a second mum and saw her almost every single day. She enjoyed going to see her aunt. She loved her aunt. It wasn't something she had to do, it was something that she wanted to do. Susan described her aunt as being very lovely and kind, and as time went on, Hilda was no longer handling her own affairs, so Susan took it upon herself to support her aunt by bringing her food, and there was also a lady that would come around and do the cleaning. Susan became her aunt's carer, dealing with her affairs for her, and it's possible at some point that Hilda may have developed dementia, because she would often forget things that had just happened. Her long-term memory was good, but short-term not so good, and sometimes she would forget that Susan had already She would often forget that Susan had already visited her during the day and would often phone her to say, "Are you coming over?" Hilda also slept on the ground floor of her house. Now, it was a two-story house, most likely because she couldn't get up the stairs without aid. The room next to the kitchen, which I presume would have been the original living room, was converted into a bedroom for her. So whenever Susan went round, she would go in via the back door, which went straight into the kitchen, and then she would walk through to the living room. Although Hilda lived on her own, with her home help coming round and Susan looking after her, she was very well cared for. Susan had been married and divorced. She had, I believe, 2 grown-up children, but she started to see a man whose name was Chris, who was much younger than her. Susan would often make several visits to her aunt, but she normally wouldn't stay late in the evening. However, on the 11th of March 1992, things were a little bit different. Hilda called Susan and said that she couldn't find the keys to her house. Susan had tried to tell her aunt to not leave the keys in the lock, because of course Susan couldn't use her own keys to get in, but to leave the keys on a shelf near the door. And she again reiterated that to Hilda, and the phone conversation ended. A short while later, Hilda called back and repeated the same conversation, totally forgetting what had been said before, and the phone conversation ended again. But Hilda then called a third time, asking the same question. So Susan actually made quite a late night visit to her aunt on the 11th of March, around 9 o'clock. And again, she tried to repeat to her aunt take the key out, leave it by the back door. That's where your keys are, but don't open the front door. And she emphasised this to her. For her own safety, don't open the door. Susan then left her aunt's house. She took her boyfriend to the pub, went home, made some phone calls, went to bed as normal. And the next morning, she went to the shop to get her aunt a sandwich and then drove the short distance from her house to Hilda's. And as she walked into the kitchen, she noticed that the house seemed very, very quiet. She put her handbag and her keys down on one side and then things that she bought for her aunt's lunch on the other side, and was calling out to her aunt almost in a jovial, joking kind of way, saying, "Come on, Mrs. M, come on, get up. What are you doing still in bed?" I believe it was around 11 o'clock-ish that this happened, but Hilda didn't answer her. Now, another thing that was strange was that the door to Hilda's bedroom, again, which I said is on the ground floor, it was ajar, whereas Hilda normally had that door closed. So Susan pushed the door open and walked into, as she described it, a scene of horror. Hilda Marchbank was lying in her bed, on top of the covers, almost completely naked, bloodied and bruised. And very sadly, she had died. And Susan was in such a state of shock that she actually, in effect, blacked out. She has no memory of what happened after the moment that she went in, saw her aunt, and then suddenly finding herself on the driveway outside the house calling for help. I've actually seen a picture of Hilda. Susan's friend Geoff has done some YouTube videos on this, and he, with a warning, did put a picture up of Hilda's face as she was found, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. She's completely purple, there's blood on the pillow. It's horrible. An 89-year-old lady, will anybody, been beaten to death. It really is heartbreaking. So if you do want to check those out, I will just give you a bit of a caution. In 2 of his videos, Geoff does show that picture. Susan has also said that what really upset her as well is not just how she was left, but that Hilda was a very private person. Even though she trusted Susan implicitly, she wouldn't show herself to anybody. And for her to be left in such a state, so undignified, that has also deeply upset Susan. At one point she said she wanted to actually get a blanket to cover her up. Before long, the police did arrive and see several items of evidence from the house. The whole house had been turned upside down. Upstairs had been ransacked, clothes pulled out everywhere, doors opened, drawers opened. This therefore indicated that this was an attempted robbery gone wrong, or a robbery gone wrong. I can't find anywhere whether or not there were items actually taken. Fingerprints, clothing fibres, footprints were all collected from the house. The fingerprints and footprints were ran through the database, obviously the fingerprints more so. They weren't linked to anybody who was in the system at all, so that gave the police absolutely no leads there. Of the fibres that were found to not be from any of Hilda's clothing, and they were also tested to see if they belonged to Susan, but they didn't. However, that's where the tests end. No more was carried out to find out to whom these fibres belonged. The neighbours in the street, of course, were interviewed. They were witnesses. And this is where it gets quite interesting, because some of the neighbours give different accounts but of the same event. And that often happens in cases where there are multiple witnesses, especially from different physical angles. At different times, they will often give very different descriptions for the same event, but they are still telling the truth. One thing that all these neighbours mentioned was that quite late at night, around midnight, a red Ford Fiesta with a bumper that was slightly sloped on one side was seen driving very slowly down that road. The slow driving gauged the attention of one of the neighbours, and at one point it was actually parked on the opposite side of the road to where it should be. One neighbour described it as having 3 people inside with the engine running but the lights off. Another time it was described as being empty with the lights on and the engine running. Another time as being empty with the lights on but no engine running. So it could be that these were at different times and the people got in and out. But this did rouse suspicion, and the neighbours gave pretty much the same description of the car, although those that could see the rear of it could describe exactly what it was. One neighbour actually said that they heard a loud noise, and this is what firstly alerted them to look out the front, and this is where they saw this red car parked right outside of Hilda's house. The person who saw the occupants of the car gave a description not only of the vehicle but also the people in it. Unfortunately, nobody actually got the registration number of the vehicle, so the police had quite a bit of work to do to track down to whom this vehicle belonged and who was in that vehicle that night. And of course, Susan was interviewed, because either if you're someone who finds a body, you're either a key witness, you've stumbled across this body, or you were going to go to that location, you saw it, or you could potentially be a suspect. So Susan was the number one key witness. Susan's family were also interviewed, including her sister Anne, after a few weeks of investigation with daily updates given to Susan, re-interviewing people. On the 30th of March 1992, the police knocked on Susan May's door and arrested her for the murder of her aunt. Susan screamed and ran upstairs to her son. She wanted to avoid the police as much as possible, but the police of course pursued her and took her back downstairs, handcuffed her, and took her into custody. This was a complete shock to everybody. The neighbours, everyone around the area knew Susan, they knew Hilda. There wasn't any kind of sense of how could this woman do this. Everybody was behind Susan. They knew how much she loved her aunt, how much she cared for her aunt. There was just outrage. Leading up to her arrest, as I said, the police gave her daily updates because she was the main person concerned about, what happened to her aunt. They kept in touch with her. They said that they were trying to help her. Susan had no idea that she was a suspect. And also, it turned out that the police had actually called off the search for the car and discarded any of that as being relevant in any way and focused solely on Susan. And she realised that they had been building a case against her for weeks. Susan was, of course, devastated. She was outraged that she'd been accused of doing something that she vehemently denied. She had such a huge support system from her friends, from her family. The whole community of Royton were 100% behind her. Of course, it was horrible what happened to Hilda. Everybody wanted to find out who this person was because they could strike again. Having a woman who appeared to care for this lady for years and years and years to be arrested for her murder, this didn't seem right. As previously mentioned, Susan's family were interviewed, which of course included her sister Anne. Anne actually said a few things that first roused suspicions with the police. The neighbours had said that they'd only seen Susan go to see her aunt. So when the police asked Anne why doesn't she go, Anne's answer was that Susan stopped her seeing her aunt, which was absolutely not the case. When Susan was re-interviewed, they didn't put this directly to her, but they basically said, "How come is it you that only cares for your aunt?" And Susan said, "My sister's not been very well recently, so I've been taking it over." This was not the case at all. The reason that Anne wasn't caring for Hilda was because Anne was actually an alcoholic, and I believe her partner at the time was as well. However, this was very hush-hush. Nobody really was supposed to know, and Susan withheld that from the police. She believed she was covering for Anne, not revealing that she was an alcoholic. And if the police had known she was an alcoholic, Anne would never have been interviewed. This was actually not the only secret. The other was Susan's relationship with a younger man called Chris Ross. Chris had actually been married to Susan's best friend, although they'd been split up for some time. And Susan had started seeing this man. He was 15 years younger than her, and nobody knew about it. It was a huge, huge secret. I'm not quite sure what led to this, but the police at some point had got wind of the affair, from whom I don't know. So they actually asked Susan, was she seeing this man? And Susan denied it. That again was a lie. The police found out that this was a lie. Unfortunately, because of what Anne had told the police and this revelation about the affair, the police just assumed that Susan was an habitual liar. In subsequent interviews, Susan said that the reason she didn't tell them the truth about her relationship with Chris Ross was because it was nothing to do with what had happened to her aunt. She didn't see the point in answering a question which was totally irrelevant. And in some ways I can understand that. But the police always like to get information that is completely outside of everything. And if somebody is found to be lying, this really does rouse suspicion, and they very rarely believe everything that person is telling them. There were other suspects as well. I think there were about 3 suspects. There had been some burglaries in the area, and of course the business about the red car. Another piece of evidence is a case of Susan's word against the police officers. One of the police officers who interviewed Susan on a specific visit that she made to the police station when she was still a witness. I believe this visit to the police station was quite early on, because apparently Susan had mentioned to the police officer before going into the room and being interviewed, so it was off record. The police officer said that Susan had specifically asked about scratches on her auntie's face, and she was supposed to have said, quote, "If forensics would be able to get stuff from down my nails." Another police officer said that Susan had been angry with her aunt because Hilda had phoned at least 3 times that evening, and Susan went round there in a rage and in a moment of seeing red just battered her auntie to death. The final piece of evidence actually came from the wall behind Hilda's bed, which had 2 marks which appeared to be handprints in a darkish kind of substance. The handprints were tested, and one of the fingertips did turn out to be Susan's, so the police said that these were 2 blood stains that were made after Susan had battered her aunt. The 3rd stain was near a light switch, which didn't appear to be a handprint or a thumbprint or anything, but still grouped them together with those 2 other stains, therefore saying that that wall had been stained by blood after Susan had committed the murder. Initially, Susan May was appointed an attorney who actually said that they would need a lot of information to try and prove her innocence. They wanted to gather as much evidence as possible, such as learning about the time of death and retesting these handprint stains and retesting the fibres. Susan chose not to use this lawyer. She chose to use her family lawyer. This lawyer was very, very confident that Susan would not get convicted. They were convinced that the police had no evidence whatsoever and just hearsay. The truth is that this lawyer had absolutely no experience whatsoever in murder trials. This was a lawyer who Susan had used her whole life. Her family had used their whole lives. This lawyer felt that there was nobody that they needed to call, no experts in any kind of field. They actually called only one witness, which was Susan's daughter Kate. Kate had actually been with Susan on the day that she'd allegedly made the comment about scratches in her fingernails, and Kate vehemently denied that this was ever said. Susan, of course, vouched she never did say that either. Susan said in an interview that she actually had read the papers about her case, which were portraying her as being a scheming, devious widow who was in it to get money, and that was one thing that the police used a lot against her, saying that she wanted to benefit from the inheritance from her aunt so she could lavish money on her boyfriend. The papers also mentioned the blood stains, and when she presented this to her solicitor, the solicitor said the jury aren't supposed to read newspapers. They're not supposed to get their information from the newspapers. They'll get it from the court, so don't worry about this. So the lawyer actually believed the information in the newspaper to have been false. It turned out that was not the case. Returning to the issue of what Susan had allegedly told an officer about scratches and fingernails, there is a huge problem with this, and Susan quite rightly pointed it out, as well as other people who support her. If someone is going to make such an incriminating statement, they should be arrested on the spot. This information was not recorded anywhere. It was just simply a case of a police officer's word against Susan's. Susan's nails were never actually scraped for any information, so if she had said this, the police probably would have done it anyway. Even if she hadn't mentioned about her nails, if she'd mentioned scratches, they really should have done that, but they didn't. Another thing that Susan pointed out was, in her own defence, was that this is not the kind of language she used anyway, such as the use of the word forensic, and why would she say something like this if she had done it, which would incriminate her on the spot? That doesn't make sense. It was interesting to note during my investigation into this that the person who actually identified the body, because they can't just take it for granted it's the right person, it has to be officially identified by a family member. It was actually Anne, Susan's sister, who identified the body. Now, she described her aunt as looking peaceful. She didn't have any breakages in the skin. There were no marks from which blood or anything could have come from. It was literally just very, very bruised. And also there is proof of this because the picture that was taken of Hilda's face, which again I've seen, shows that although she is very, very purple from obviously the, being dead, but also the bruises, there's no scratches on her face at all. The police believed that Susan wanted to inherit her aunt's money and therefore killed her to inherit so she could lavish money on her boyfriend. The only thing is, the house had actually been ransacked and Susan had access to anything in the house. She could have taken anything at any time that she wanted. A motive as well in itself isn't actually evidence. It can be used to support evidence, but it can't be used as a sole piece of evidence. Susan actually had lasting power of attorney over her aunt, so she had legal control over everything. But that information was never presented by her defense. Her defense didn't put forth a good case at all, and even the testimony of her daughter wouldn't be strong enough because a family member, probably to a jury, might still actually lie about something to protect their loved one. Susan's defense didn't object to things that they really should have objected to. It was just left to play out. Again, the lawyer that Susan used had no experience whatsoever in murder cases. It seems absolutely ridiculous that even if you've not done something, you need to make sure your solicitor knows what they're doing. The forensic evidence of the handprints was also presented to the jury in not the right way, let's just put it that way. The photographs of the stains were presented to the jury, but they were photographs of the stains after they'd been treated with a chemical which was supposed to have been to detect DNA, but it actually changed the stain to make it much stronger and much darker. The original stain was so faint that you'd have to really look carefully or squint to see it. If these stains were not blood, it still wouldn't hold up because Susan was a regular visitor to the house. She could have put those stains there at any point by putting her hand in any kind of substance. The jury were told categorically that these stains were blood. The cleaner also testified that the wall was very, very stained. So these particular stains that somehow stood out, Susan mentioned as well that she couldn't remember if she'd actually touched her aunt or not because she kind of blacked out after she saw everything. She may have touched her aunt, she may have got blood on her hands, she may have braced herself against the wall because the handprints were like this, in an attempt to just calm herself down. And if she'd said that she did brace herself against the wall, they couldn't have really used that as evidence against her because even if she had blood on her hands, even if she had touched her aunt and put the prints there, that doesn't necessarily mean that she actually did it. The expert, whom the police used to determine what the stains were, did say that it was conclusively blood. It turned out later, many years later, that this turned out not to be the case. The stain by the light was found out to be blood. I'm not quite sure to whom it belonged. It could have been put there by Susan, it could have been put there by the cleaner, anyone who visited the house, it could have been by Hilda herself. Susan did not get a fair trial at all. As I said, her defense was extremely weak. The jury were never told about the red car, they were never told about the other suspects. They had to take on board exactly what they were told. They were told by the forensic experts that these stains were definitely in blood. They were told about what the police believed the motive was. They told the jury about the comment that Susan was supposed to have made. I did some more research and I found that the lawyer that Susan had gone to, a family lawyer, they did call one forensic expert. I'm not quite sure what he was going to tell them, but for some reason this person was turned away while he was waiting for his turn at the court to testify. It's my subjective opinion, but I think Susan's lawyer was overwhelmed and realised that no matter what they did, it couldn't turn this around. 14 months after Hilda Marchbank was brutally beaten and left to die in her house, her niece Susan May was found guilty of her murder. 4 years later, a very flimsy appeal was launched but was not successful. Now, when it comes to launching appeals, I'm not sure what it is like in other countries, but in the UK, if there is evidence that was available during the first trial, even if it wasn't used, if it was available to be used, if you could request it, and if there was an opportunity there to use it, it cannot be used in the appeal. It can't even be mentioned in the appeal. It has to be new and compelling evidence, and that's very difficult when there's plenty of evidence that would have cleared Susan, but they couldn't use it. I mentioned a gentleman called Geoff who has done some YouTube videos on the case. He set up a group called the Friends of Susan May, which was made up of people around the area, family members of Susan, and they vowed to look into the entire case to try to see if they could clear Susan's name. They were certain that Susan was innocent. It also meant that Hilda had not received justice either. The Friends of Susan May consulted with a charity called Innocent, and their focus is to make sure that victims of miscarriages of justice have their convictions quashed and they receive justice, so that more steps can be taken to make sure that the original victim also receives justice. They went through the files, found very compelling evidence which, if had been presented at the original trial, would have cleared Susan's name. Again, they couldn't use it. A second appeal was nonetheless launched, and the solicitor who was actually in charge of that appeal was someone called Campbell Malone. Now, I've mentioned him before because he actually was the solicitor who successfully had Stefan Kishko's conviction quashed. Now, that was the first case I covered on this channel. I'll put a link up here so you can go and see that for yourself. This man had a wealth of experience, and he was able to find information that would definitely conclude that Susan was not guilty of this crime. He was able to find some new evidence. Therefore, a second appeal, a very strong appeal, was launched. I mentioned the stains on the wall earlier, and that the police were told by an expert that they definitely were bloodstains. It turned out they actually weren't, and Campbell Malone and his team of lawyers and the Friends of Susan May were able to find a specialist who was able to retest the substances and found that actually, especially the first stain, the most strong stain, was actually made in sweat. The so-called forensic expert who originally told the jury in the first trial that these stains were blood and that he conducted a chemical test of his own concoction was not actually qualified to do that examination. They had no expertise in that field, and they used a chemical which would never have shown what kind of substance it was. Specific chemicals are supposed to be used on bloodstains in crime scenes to determine if they are actually blood. You can't just make a concoction and then spray it on it and then find out what it is. It turned out there was a fourth stain, and that stain was identical to the first two stains, which were the handprints, but they weren't checked at the time of the murder. At this point, Susan has been in prison for 10 years, and during this time she has done a degree through the Open University, but one thing that she mentioned she never did was she never took part in any of the workshops or counselling sessions which are designed for convicted people in prison to A, admit guilt, and B, rehabilitate themselves to make sure that when they do go out of prison that they're not going to offend again. If you are convicted in a court of law, the prison system has to treat you as a convicted person, and they're not able to say, well, no, you didn't do it, therefore we're going to help you out with that. They will put a lot of pressure on prisoners to admit what they've done and then work from there. Appointments were made for Susan with a psychiatrist or counsellors, but she would never actually have the session. She'd go along to them, she'd open the door and say, I'm not coming in. And of course, the psychologists and psychiatrists were saying, well, if, you can come in and talk. And she said, no, I've got nothing to say because you're going to focus on me admitting guilt. Therefore, I can't help you. You can't help me. And she wouldn't go to those sessions. She completely refused to cooperate. Quite a lot of the time, if someone doesn't admit guilt when they're in prison, if they don't take part in the rehabilitation courses or courses for offenders, there's a chance that they will actually end up serving their entire full tariff, which in Susan's case was life, rather than the minimum that they normally would. Susan also mentioned that in the early days of her incarceration, she had a firm belief that almost every day when new intakes came in, she would wait and see if she saw someone running in saying, "Mum, it's been a mistake, you can come home." She genuinely believed for months that that would happen, but it never did. Since the first appeal, it also came to light that there was a piece of evidence which had been discovered at the original investigation, but was not available at the time, so this time it could be used. And it turned out that the police had apparently misfiled a piece of information about the red car. It had been believed up until this point that the red car has never been found. However, it turned out the red car was found 2 weeks after the murder of Hilda Marchbank. At the time of the murder, it was owned by a woman whose brother was part of a criminal network known only as Mr. X. 3 days after Hilda's murder, the vehicle was actually sold. Mr. X cannot be identified, and the reason for this is because he himself was murdered by a member of a criminal network 6 years after Hilda's murder. The man who was convicted of Mr. X's murder said that apparently Mr. X had bragged over the years that he murdered an old lady in that particular part of Royton in 1992, but he would never get caught because someone else was doing his time. Mr. X's murderer actually mentioned this to Susan's lawyer, so they did use that information. That sounds very, very compelling, but the problem is it's someone else telling someone else what someone else told them. We could argue that the murderer of Mr. X had nothing to gain by saying this. He also had nothing to lose by saying this. But why on earth would he say it, and where would he get this information from if he didn't know about this murder? As I said, Mr. X was part of a criminal network, so it's likely that his family was involved as well as friends, and also his own murderer may have been part of a rival gang. With criminal gangs, they tend to keep the information within themselves, and there was actually evidence that a family member of Mr. X knew about Hilda's murder before her body was discovered the next day, and this person actually told the police that their family member had told them about it, but I don't quite know what happened to that evidence. Obviously it's come to light that did happen, but I don't quite know why it never made it into a lead and why the police actually called off the search for the red car when there was so much of this evidence. Mr. X actually was one of the original suspects. The police knew who he was. The information about the red car, Mr. X, and this anonymous phone call to the police about what he told them the night of the murder, this information was apparently misfiled. Now, read into that what you will. I'm not accusing anyone of anything, but it does seem a little bit suspicious. During the second appeal, Campbell Malone also looked back at how Susan was treated immediately after the murder. She was actually apparently interviewed as a key witness, but she was unofficially a suspect. Now, when you're a suspect, you're supposed to be given different rights to someone who is just a witness, and that's why they read people's rights, etc., because they can have free legal advice, they can have a solicitor present with them, you have to be told about your right to remain silent. Susan was never presented with any of this. She did not even know that she was a suspect, so she was quite happy to talk to the police. She could have easily said no comment, but she didn't know that she had that right. Despite a lot of overwhelming evidence, despite Campbell Malone's massive amount of expertise in this area, the appeal was unsuccessful. The judge in this case determined that the original conviction was safe, and nothing presented persuaded him otherwise. There's been a lot of criticism about this judge. George mentioned that this judge apparently was angry about having to review this case, that he was angry from the get-go and didn't really want to spend a lot of time on it. Sometimes it could be a case of no matter how highly someone is trained, it could be that they've already made up in their mind that none of the evidence here is going to support a conviction that needs to be quashed. It's almost as if he'd made his mind up before any of that took place. Now, there were some bits of evidence which were not presented in the appeal. There were some opportunities for objection which were not taken. However, with all the evidence presented, the case really should have been won in Susan's favour. Susan actually originally went to Risley Prison and then to Durham Prison. She was in prison at the same time as Myra Hindley and Rose West. 6 months after Susan's incarceration, her 83-year-old mother was desperate to see her. She called the prison and she begged them to let Susan see her. The governor of this prison was very, very good, and they allowed Susan to go home with some officers escorting her, of course, so she could spend the day in her mother's house in the front room, and they had tea together. This was the last time that Susan and her mother would ever meet, as Susan's mother died that very night. Susan's mother, like everybody else, was 100% behind her daughter, and she had already lost her older sister. She'd also had to go through this horrible thing about her daughter being convicted of a crime that she was confident she did not commit. And then Susan had to go through the agony of losing her mother. During the time that Susan was in prison, her sister Anne also died, and she couldn't go to the funeral. That was another shock to her. Even though Anne may have been somebody who originally put doubts with the police, she was still family, and this is another tragedy, another blow to Susan. Susan's children also married and had their own children, another thing that she missed out on. I've also seen in other interviews that Susan had mentioned that she never really had a chance to grieve for her aunt because she was obsessed. She ate, drank and slept this case. It was all enveloping. It was constant in her mind. She was constantly thinking about the case, never thinking about anything else. It was everything to her to prove her innocence. So she never really had time to get over her aunt's death. While she was in prison as well, she found it extremely tough, not just because prison itself is tough, and she mentioned that it's very damaging process for people, but it was very difficult to get people to help her who were convinced that she was guilty, because of course in the eyes of the law she was guilty. And if you look at the court case, the original court case, it's no wonder the jury came with a guilty verdict. But she had to keep writing letters, she had to keep imploring people to help her. Anyone to whom she could turn, the press, MPs, solicitors, she had to go to huge lengths to get people to listen to her. One of Susan's friends in prison actually spent quite a bit of time with her, and quite a lot of time in prison people will deny their crimes, even if they are de facto guilty. In this particular case, Susan's friend kind of interrogated her and kind of pressed her story a bit, tried to poke holes in her story, tried to trip her up, but it turned out Susan's stories were completely solid. Her friend could not poke any holes or find any inconsistencies in her story, so she as well started to support Susan and realised that this was a case of a miscarriage of justice. However, the letters that Susan wrote, the fuss she made, did pay off, because over 100 MPs found out about Susan's case. They independently reviewed the entire file and realised that this was a case of wrongful conviction. Unfortunately, the only way of proving that is via the Court of Appeal. So even this many MPs, they can't just go to the government and say and overturn this conviction because of what's happened. It has to go through the official process. So many MPs were behind this. 12 years after her conviction, Susan May was actually released from prison. However, her conviction had not been overturned. She was released, but still a convicted murderer in the eyes of the law. As I mentioned earlier, the prison system, there's a huge emphasis on omitting guilt, and if people don't take responsibility and own their crimes, the likelihood is that they're going to serve their full tariff. However, in this case, Susan actually was released on the very first day that she would be eligible for parole, despite her having blanket refused to do anything in prison that had anything to do with rehabilitation. She was released on that very first day. That is very interesting, and it's my subjective opinion that this was because the powers that be, who have control over where prisoners are released, such as these MPs, even if they couldn't overturn a conviction, they still saw to it that she could be released as soon as she possibly could. There is a difference between being de facto innocent or guilty, or lawfully guilty or innocent. De facto means you did it or you didn't do it. Nobody legal can say otherwise. But in the eyes of the law, if someone is convicted, as far as they're concerned, they did it. And they have to declare their conviction. Susan actually found it impossible to get employment after leaving prison because of her conviction, but the fact that she'd spent so long in prison, she mentioned that there's a huge stigmata about it, that if you've been in prison, then you're unemployable, despite her having done a degree. Susan even said that she didn't actually want to be released from prison the way that she was. She wanted to be released as a free woman, and unfortunately she didn't get that wish. So Susan was released in 2005 and continued to try to prove her innocence. Unfortunately, that was not to be, as in 2003, at the age of 68, Susan May died from breast cancer. She never, ever got to see her conviction quashed. If I could have said personally anything to Susan, and I think many people probably would say the same thing, in my opinion, she had already cleared her name, because in people's minds, in people's view, she was innocent, because there's so much evidence pointing to her innocence. It's simply that on paper she was guilty, but the paper doesn't really mean anything, because so many people have been cleared of charges or not being convicted because of unsafe previous convictions or lack of evidence. But does paper really matter? Or what matters is the minds of people. If people believe you to be innocent or believe you to be guilty, and of course in yourself, if you know you haven't done it, then you can hold your head up high. But Susan still, to her dying breath, wanted her conviction overturned. A year before she passed away, Susan made a review of her case, and she submitted it to what's called the CCRC, and it actually turned out, remember what I said before about the red car being found, that came to light after the second appeal, so that was fresh evidence thereafter. Fibres were recovered from the vehicle, but they had never actually been reviewed, never compared to the original fibres from the scene. It also turned out that there was a case of non-disclosure in the original trial. There was plenty of evidence that was collected, but never actually noted anywhere. So this was fresh evidence that could be used. So if evidence is collected, but it's not actually documented, nobody would know about it, therefore the information is not available. So that can then come forward as available information. When Susan originally launched her first and second appeals, her lawyers were told that no photographs of the original stains on the wall ever existed. But after her year 2000 appeal, it came to light that there were. Susan found them herself when she was examining her own files. One of the reasons why the second appeal didn't actually work was because the superintendent who was first on the scene of the crime at the time in 1992 came by and actually put his case forward to the judge. The judge actually credited the superintendent as being a very reliable witness, as being somebody who could make it safe and secure in his own mind that this conviction was definitely safe. He said that these handprints were definitely blood, definitely Hilda's, and of course the fingerprint did actually turn out to be Susan's. However, later, it was actually after that appeal, it was determined that the stains were not in blood. The actual chemical test needed to determine if stains are blood was carried out again, so the actual part of the wall was taken, the wallpaper was taken. They were tested again and found that there was actually no blood there at all. In the expert opinion of the people whose Susan solicitor appointed after she'd been released, found that the stains were sweat, as I previously mentioned. Susan herself actually headhunted a forensic expert. He also examined the fingerprint, which of course was Susan's, and found that there were paw marks. And when I say paw, I mean as in the little tiny holes in your hands. He found there were paw marks. Now, you wouldn't get that with blood. It would be matte. It would be all the way around. With paw marks, that definitely shows the presence of sweat. In addition, a further examination found that there was actually a rather darkish stain, the fingerprint that I previously mentioned, but that had actually been made subsequent to the actual whole handprint. So it seems that the actual handprint on the wall was an old stain, and the fingerprint was over the top of that original stain. Therefore, the handprints on the wall were not made at the time of Hilda's murder. Another detective was interviewed, and he actually said that when he arrived on the scene, he didn't actually see any stains on the wall. As I said, it was very well stained, but he couldn't see those particular stains standing out to him at all. Geoff Goodwin, Susan's friend, has done a huge in-depth analysis, and I'm actually going to link his videos below, because they are really definitely a watch. But I will again give a warning that you will see Hilda's face in two of them. The superintendent, who was first on the scene again, he actually put his hand into the stain of blood on the pillow, and when he was asked why he did this, he said he was checking to see if Hilda was alive. Now, it was obvious that she had died, and he didn't have to touch her to do that, and he actually got blood on his fingers. He could have easily put blood anywhere in that place. The tragedy of this is that Susan never got the opportunity to move on with her life. Yes, she had a family and her grandchildren, but she never really regained her freedom, and Hilda never got justice. If this Mr. X, or whoever it was who was actually responsible for this murder, has ruined Susan's life, ended Hilda's life, yes, she was 89, but she could have gone on for a lot longer because she wasn't actually unwell, and also, I believe, contributed to Susan's mother's demise as well. Susan's family still hold this burden. Her conviction, as of today, has still not been overturned. I think the only satisfaction is that over 100 members of the House of Lords are convinced that she was innocent. And as I said, if in people's mind, especially the minds that matter, know you to be innocent, I think that's the only catharsis really that you could have. It may not be on paper, but I do believe that the legal system did believe that there is a miscarriage of justice here, but they have to still work within the legal processes, and they can't step outside of that. I have watched a couple of documentaries, interviews with Susan, interviews with her family. I read the judge's comments, Susan's online blog. I do believe this to be a case of a miscarriage of justice. Even though this was 28 years ago, personally, I believe that someone out there still does know something. I do believe that there may be some members of this criminal network to whom Mr. X belonged who do know what happened, and that they could come forward and provide more information about this, that there still could be a chance that someone knows something, and maybe even the police officers who originally dealt with this case. I don't know if this was a case of corruption or confirmation bias, or that it just happened to be coincidence that Susan was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong false evidence, in my opinion, that it kind of led them astray. But I do feel that there are people who know what happened, who have more, or at least more information that could really help Susan's case. Even though she's passed away, her family still carry this. They need to move on. And it also, the original case needs to be opened. If Mr. X didn't do it, then somebody else did. And if he did, he's never going to get a trial, but at least they will be able to look into some other avenues and eliminate those. And if it turns out that all the evidence points to Mr. X, at least that avenue will be explored. Susan showed such resilience and strength to the very, very end. If she had never got cancer, I believe she would have fought this until she was Hilda's age or older. She would have gone on and done this. It really says a lot about her character that she remained strong and she never gave up. She never said, look, do you know what, I'm out of prison now, I'm just going to move on. She never did that. That is a very admirable thing to do. That is it for this case. I hope this was insightful. I hope this has inspired you to do your own research into this. And if you know anything, please get in contact with Geoff Goodwin. As I said, his YouTube channel is linked below. I'm sure you'll be able to contact him if necessary. And I really hope everybody is staying safe amidst what's going on. I have more cases to do. My next one will be not on a murder, even though I've done several murders so far. This one will be on a case of an unsolved mystery. Now, this is going to be my first officially unsolved mystery that I've done on this channel. Of course, discounting the Michael Jackson case because that is still unsolved. I do believe that this case needs to be told. We need to learn our lessons from this and make sure this never ever happens again. Nothing comes before justice, not just for the victim's family. They don't need this hanging over them, and we need to make sure that people who are a danger to the public need to be held accountable for what they're doing. They need to be rehabilitated, and they also need to be placed in a position where they cannot hurt anybody else anymore. Good night, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. Bye.